It's the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. The U.S. military is about to send 7,500 combat troops to Norway for Exercise Cold Response 2020, where they will join thousands of allied NATO troops in the Finnmark district along the border to Russia to participate in war games that will take place in mid-March. These maneuvers have been held every other year since 2006, but their increased size and importance are raising credible fears that NATO and the United States are preparing to use the Arctic as a battleground for a possible conflict with Russia. Why have these NATO games in such a northern latitude been gaining in importance? U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo openly explained the rationale when he visited Finland in May of last year.
The Arctic is at the forefront of opportunity and abundance. It houses 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of its undiscovered gas, and an abundance of uranium, rare earth minerals, gold, diamonds, and millions of square miles of untapped resources. Fisheries galore. And its centerpiece, the Arctic Ocean, is rapidly taking on new strategic significance. Offshore resources, which are helping their respective coastal states, are the subject of renewed competition. Steady reductions in sea ice are opening new passageways and new opportunities for trade. This could potentially slash the time it takes to travel between Asia and the West by as much as 20 days. Arctic sea lanes could come the 21st century Suez and Panama canals. Under President Trump, we're fortifying America's security and diplomatic presence in the area. On the security side, partly in response to Russia's destabilizing activities, we are hosting military exercises, strengthening our force presence, rebuilding our icebreaker fleet, expanding Coast Guard funding, and creating a new senior military post for Arctic affairs inside of our own military.
Pompeo also explained that in addition to the threat that Russia represents, so does China. Joining me now to discuss the significance of NATO's Exercise Cold Response are Michael Clare and Eric Vold. Michael is the nation's defense correspondent and professor emeritus of peace and world security studies at Hampshire College. His latest book is All Hell Breaking Loose: The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Eric, who joins us from Oslo, is a Norwegian political analyst and author and is working as a foreign policy advisor to the parliamentary group of the leftist Red Party of Norway. Thanks, Michael and Eric, for joining us today. So let's start with the Arctic, why the Arctic has become of such great interest to the United States. We saw earlier Secretary of State Mike Pompeo already explained it pretty well in that clip, but January, once again, the month of January, beat all climate records as the warmest January in recorded history. Michael, talk about how climate change is driving this scramble for the Arctic.
Well, at one point you couldn't go there. You couldn't go near there because it was covered with ice. The region was impenetrable, but because of climate change and the rapidly rising temperatures in the Arctic, the ice cap is receding, and that's making it possible to drill for oil and natural gas and other resources in the Arctic region. And this has led to a scramble to extract those resources by giant energy firms from around the world. So this has made the region much more of importance from a geopolitical perspective. And it's especially true of Russia, because Russia highly depends on the sale of oil and natural gas to prop up its economy. Something like 25% of its foreign income comes from the sale of oil and gas. And at present, most of that oil and natural gas that it sells to Europe and Asia comes from reserves below the Arctic Circle, but those are running out. So for Russia to continue to rely on oil and gas reserves to power its economy, it has to go above the Arctic Circle. And so from Moscow's perspective, the development of Arctic resources is absolutely crucial. And this is something that President Vladimir Putin has said over and over again, and has invested vast resources, economic inputs into developing the new oil and gas fields discovered above the Arctic Circle in Russia's territory. But as we'll discuss, this creates problems for Russia because it's very hard to deliver those new oil and gas reserves to the rest of the world because of the distance from markets. And this has put a new emphasis on trade routes that pass by northern Norway, which is where this exercise is being held.
All right. Talk to us also about the U.S. interest that is in the resources, because you make an interesting point in one of your articles for The Nation, where you point out also that even if we aren't right away running out of natural resources in the Middle East, there's an issue that climate change in the Middle East is actually driving also what's happening in the Arctic. Explain that to us.
Yes, indeed. If you look at the latest scientific literature on what we could expect from climate change in the future, the Middle East region, especially the Persian Gulf, which is where most of oil drilling is occurring at present, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and so on, those areas are going to become unbearably hot in summer months. You can expect in decades to come that summertime temperatures during the day are likely to average above 110 degrees Fahrenheit and very possibly above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's almost impossible for humans to survive for very long in those temperatures. And a lot of equipment breaks down under those circumstances. So it's very possible that it'll become impossible to produce oil and gas in that region. That makes production in the Arctic much more attractive as those areas become impossible to operate in the Middle East. So the oil companies, American and British oil companies, are increasingly looking towards the Arctic as a future source of production to ensure that they have adequate supplies.
Eric, I want to turn to you now. Now, what has Norway done to facilitate the scramble for Arctic resources? I mean, Norway is usually seen as a peace-loving country, the home of the Nobel Peace Prize, after all. To what extent and why is Norway supporting U.S. ambitions there via NATO?
Well, Norway joined the NATO in 1949, and that was a very controversial decision. And because Norway is a country that is situated on the border with Russia, at that time, the Soviet Union had just liberated a big chunk of Norwegian territory from Nazi occupation. So there was very little appetite in the Norwegian population to sort of antagonize the Russians by letting the US enter Norwegian territory with heavy military equipment. So we had these self-imposed restrictions on US military presence, for example, not permitting US military bases on Norwegian soil in peacetime, and not permitting the presence of US nukes on Norwegian territory. Now, this policy, this very prudent policy that served us very well for about 70 years, has been rolled back by this current government, which is more and more inclined to supporting the US and to supporting US militarization of the Arctic that is deemed to be threatening by the Russians. Now, I can give you a very illustrative example. In 2018, the Norwegian government introduced a proposal basically asking the parliament for a grant of about 1 billion kroners, about $1 million, for satellite-based broadband connection in the northern Norway. Now, this was presented as a proposal to improve internet connection for business, for fishery, for maritime security, shipping, and for the Norwegian defense. And of course, this grant was voted favorably, unanimously by the parliament. Now, a couple of days later, it turned out that this grant was going to be used on something completely different. It turned out that these satellites were going to carry communication equipment for the US military directly connected to US nuclear-armed submarines that were using the Arctic territories of Norwegian maritime territory, getting close to Russia. And it also turned out that the reason why the Americans wanted to use civilian Norwegian satellites instead of US military satellites was because the US military considered that any satellite carrying communication equipment for US nuclear capabilities would become possible targets for attacks from those countries that feel threatened by the presence of US nukes close to their borders. In this case, it would be Russia and China. So what this goes to show is the way that the US is increasingly using Norwegian territory and Norwegian civilian infrastructure to move nuclear and conventional military, offensive military capabilities closer and closer to the Russian border, and that the way that this is being done is through, to a large extent, through secrecy and deceptions, sometimes even undermining important principles of the Norwegian democracy.
Michael, I want to get to that point that Eric is raising about increasing U.S. military presence in Norway. So we're not just talking about the NATO maneuvers that are happening in early March. So what has the U.S. so far deployed there, and what kinds of risks do these deployments represent?
So step back for a minute. The U.S. over the past 2 years has adopted a new military strategy. For the past 20 years or so, since 2001, since 9/11, the guiding strategy of the United States has been the global war on terror. And that's led, of course, to a focus on Iraq, to Afghanistan, and other countries where the US has been fighting the various ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on. 2 years ago, the Department of Defense adopted a new national security strategy, which emphasizes what they call great power competition, meaning the rivalry between the US, Russia, and China. And on this basis, the US increasingly views Russia and China as its main adversary. And in this shift in strategy emphasizes that while the US was focusing on the wars, what we call the forever wars, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, that Russia and China have built up their military capabilities and put NATO and the US at a disadvantage. And that therefore, it's essential that the US and NATO build up their capabilities again to deflect and to contain and push back Russian and Chinese advances. So now looking at Norway and Scandinavia, the US sees a big Russian buildup in the Kola Peninsula. That's the area that adjoins Norway in the far north. Huge buildup of Russian forces there, and this is seen as a new or an expanded threat to NATO and to US forces in general, because those forces that the Russians have deployed in Kola Peninsula, especially in Murmansk, the big naval base there, include nuclear forces. So in response, the US has undertaken a drive to beef up its forces in that region. And that has included, as Eric said earlier, the positioning of a permanent deployment of American forces, that is, in this case, Marine deployments of several hundred Marines in north-central Norway, but more importantly, under agreement with the Norwegian government. This is not well known in the United States at all. I don't even know if Norwegians know about it. The US has established large caves, I think in the area to the east of Trondheim in north-central Norway, which hold hundreds, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and armored personnel carriers, ammunition, all the stocks you need to fight a major war. So there is an anticipation on the US side that we may have to fight a major war with Russia in the far north, in the area adjoining the Kola Peninsula. And the exercise that we're about to see, Cold Response 2020, US forces will fly to Norway and then go to those caves and extract all of those tanks that have been pre-positioned in Norway, move to the northern part of Norway, and engage in a mock war with Russia. So there's an assumption now in the Pentagon that northern Norway will be a major battlefield in any war with Russia, and in fact could be the starting place for World War III.
Actually, Eric, this is exactly the next issue I wanted to touch on with you. I mean, just as Michael says, Norway would be in the middle of such a confrontation, whether it's nuclear or conventional. Now, what's been the reaction within Norway to this militarization?
That's true. I mean, Norway used to be a kind of a buffer zone between Russia or the USSR and the US. And through those Norwegian policies of limiting US presence in northern Norway, that position was maintained until pretty recently, because the current government has done a lot to tear down those limitations and basically scrap Norway's role as a buffer zone. So well, reactions are slow. I mean, defense policies, the whole security issue, big power competition, that issue has basically been marginalized since the end of the Cold War. But I think it's the Norwegian people is slowly realizing the risks that this implies for Norway. I mean, we have enjoyed so many decades of peace, and the risk of war has basically not been on the agenda. But what we are seeing now is that by scrapping that prudent policy of maintaining a certain distance to the US, even though being allies, by scrapping that policy, the risk of war is not reduced, it's increasing. We're seeing basically a security dilemma in which the increased military presence of the US in Norway makes Russia look at Norway with different eyes. I mean, the Russians never feared Norway, a small country of 5 million inhabitants with whom they've maintained peace for almost 1,000 years. But when this country is, when US nuclear capabilities are connected to Norwegian civilian infrastructure, and when Norwegian territory is used to build up US military presence, then Russian guns are slowly being, to a more of an extent, being pointed towards Norway, because what the Russians do fear is that Norwegian territory is being used for aggressive purposes by the US against Russia. And so that increases the risk of Norway being drawn into this big power rivalry between Russia and the US. It also increases the risks for the Russians, so they're increasing their military spending. And unfortunately, this is also something that might stimulate increased defense spending in the US, because to the extent that the US engages in Norway, probably in the case and increasing the risk of a conflict, maybe the most probable scenario is a conflict arising from a misunderstanding. When so much heavy military power is concentrated on such a small area, that's the way it can happen. So in case of a misunderstanding in which the Russians fear a US attack, they take some kind of preliminary action to protect their military capabilities in the Kola Peninsula, then the US will feel much more obliged to intervene in order to maintain their credibility as a security guarantor towards other NATO states. So it also increases the risk of the US being drawn into a conflict unnecessarily based on a misunderstanding. So what we're going to see is three nations, everyone spending more on defense and getting less security in return from it.
Michael, I was just wondering if you could add to that. I mean, this was one of your points in your Nation article as well, that this could be the main area for World War III. And why is that? I mean, why is Russia building up so much? After all, they've got access to the entire, more access to the Arctic than any other country in the world. So why is it such a hotspot?
Well, this partly is a matter of geography, and I hope that you can put a map of this area to highlight this fact. That is to say that although Russia has a number of ports, the port at Murmansk is the only one that offers Russian submarines open access to the Atlantic Ocean and to the other oceans of the world. They can't on the Atlantic side. They also have ports on the Pacific. So and one needs a minute to understand something about nuclear strategy. Russia relies on its nuclear submarines, nuclear missile-armed submarines, as its secure deterrent to a U.S. first strike. If the U.S. were to strike first and destroy all Russian missile silos, they count on their submarines submerged as a final deterrent to such a strike, because they're supposedly more secure from detection and attack. But they have to get out into the water, and that's Murmansk is therefore essential to them for that reason. Hence, the United States, as it increasingly sees the possibility of a nuclear war with Russia, sees that area where the submarines would exit from Murmansk to go out into the ocean as a crucial future nuclear war zone. Hence, the US has established with Norway a radar base at the very far north of Norway in Finnmark, just 45 miles from the border with Russia, and to track Russian submarines. This means in the event of a clash that had a nuclear potential, northern Norway would be an immediate nuclear target for Russia. So you could see how this area is being caught up in the nuclear planning scenarios of both sides. And it's important to understand in this discussion that as we are shifting to this great power competition that we've been discussing, the US and I think the other great powers are also moving away from the strategy of mutual assured destruction, MAD as it was called, MAD, which said that any nuclear war would be so catastrophic that we're not even going to think about a first strike. We're only going to retain a secure second strike and not even think about nuclear war. But that's changing. The US and Russia and China, it appears, are thinking more and more about the possibility of fighting and winning a nuclear war. I think this is utterly insane and immoral, highly immoral, but that is the case. And so nuclear battlefields are emerging, places where nuclear strikes might occur. And this area of northern Norway and Murmansk would be at the very top of the list of possible targets in the event of a nuclear war. I could say more about this, but this is a matter of geography, and you have to see Murmansk adjoining northern Norway as a prime battlefield in any outset of a nuclear war.
Well, I think it's also important to reflect on how these two kind of apocalyptic scenarios, that is, of climate change and of nuclear war, are coming together in this particular issue. It's really quite something. But we're going to leave it there for now. We'll certainly continue to follow this as we usually do. I was speaking to Michael Clare, the nation's defense correspondent and professor emeritus of peace and world security studies at Hampshire College, and Eric Vold, foreign policy advisor for the parliamentary group of the Red Party of Norway. Thanks again, Michael and Eric, for having joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.